Now we're actually on probably one of the most critical pages of the whole contract, and it deals with the time frames that the buyer and seller have to meet to fulfill their contract obligations. And the first one in paragraph 14, it's talking about the removal of contingencies and cancellation rights of both parties. So they each have to follow these outlined guidelines to fulfill their obligations, the tasks that they have to complete during these time frames. And any of these time frames, if they need to be modified for whatever reason, it has to be done in writing and it has to be mutually agreed upon. And both parties have to continue to act in good faith to culminate in a closed transaction. The seller has 7 days to provide all disclosures to the buyer. The NHD, the CC&Rs, and all the various disclosures, he's supposed to provide those in the first 7 days. And then the buyer has 17 days to review all those reports and disclosures, to ask any questions of the seller that he might have, and also to complete all of his investigations on the property to see if there's any sorts of issues that he wants to investigate further or ask the seller to take some sort of action. In paragraph 14b2 is where it says the buyer may request that seller make repairs or take any other action regarding the property. Sometimes a buyer would rather have a monetary contribution so that he can hire his own contractors to fix whatever might be wrong with the property. But here's a line that many agents I don't even think knows it exists in the purchase contract, and it's right where this arrow is. It says, seller has no obligation to agree to or to respond to buyer's request. Many buyer's agents make the mistake of telling their buyer, well, the seller's obligated to correct any code violations, or if he's done something without permits, he's got to make it right. Well, according to the contract, the seller doesn't even have to respond to the buyer's request. So be careful what you promise. Now, the buyer has to, once his contingencies are met and he's done all of his due diligence, he has to provide a removal of the contingencies. And this is CAR form CR. Or if he's not satisfied, he can cancel the agreement. Within the first 17 days, he can cancel the agreement and get his deposit back. Once the buyer has signed off and removed all of his contingencies, the seller cannot cancel the agreement. So now the seller is also obligated because the buyer has done his due diligence and has performed according to the contract. Well, what rights does the seller have to cancel? If the buyer is not complying and doing everything he needs to get done during his time frame, and he's not providing his removal of contingencies in writing, perhaps he failed to make his deposit, his initial deposit, or perhaps the funds were not good when they put the deposit in escrow. Perhaps the buyer has not returned all of his disclosures signed during the 17 days. These are various reasons the seller could actually cancel the agreement. But prior to canceling, the seller has to put the buyer on notice. He has to give him a notice to perform. So he has to put the buyer on notice in writing that there's certain actions that he needs to take. And he can only give this notice 2 days prior to whatever that action is. So let's say the seller wants to make sure he's going to remove his contingencies. So the buyer has 17 days and the seller could put him on notice on day 15. That's the soonest as he could do that. Here in paragraph D, once the buyer has removed all of his contingencies in writing and he's elected to move forward with the purchase of this property, if for some reason towards the end of the transaction he gets